one of those places that might get swallowed by the ocean. It's actually not. Florida's actually one of those places that might not make it, but maybe they'll relocate it. But so long as there's a Samuel Proctor oral history program, and maybe it gets moved to Michigan or something like that, these will be preserved. I didn't want to tell everyone at first because I don't know, but I don't know. I always like if I talk too early about things, I got like so many haters. Like people just want to like bring me down. They were like, "Don't work with him," So like, um, I need to make sure things are solid and the ink dries before I start like announcing things.
Right, right, right.
But we're live. We're live here, and we're live with Jeff Rogers today, and very very excited. Jeff is a poet, kind of wow performance artist. He's not just a poet. He does very interesting things, just as a writer in general. But Jeff, before we get started talking about some of the projects you've been a part of, let's start with how you get started. I mean, when did you know that you wanted to be a writer?
Um, I knew pretty early. Um, when I was a kid, my mom used to read to me every night before I went to bed for years and years and years. And I, it was so magical. It was like weaving a spell. What people did with words and what she did with her voice. And I felt like it was something magical. And she would read me stuff that involved magic of a kind often, like Wizard of Oz, Winnie the Pooh, Lord of the Rings. And I had this sense that words could weave spells, words could get at important secrets and the hearts of mysteries, and that working with words was a kind of wizardry, and it was something that early on I decided I wanted to figure out how to do. It called to me. Also, another aspect really was that my dad, who was always a big hero for me, had almost a kind of hero worship of his favorite writers. So the part of me that wanted my dad's regard, I think subconsciously felt like, oh, if I can be a writer, then I can be a hero too. I can be a hero to my dad, So in a way, I conceived of being a writer as almost like being a kind of a hero, and a kind of a wizard. And so I started writing stories pretty young, before I was 10, so it was something I always wanted to do. For many years, I didn't have the courage and self-confidence to say that out loud, but I guess by the time I was in mid-high school, probably junior, senior year of high school, I started having the courage to say it out loud and really decided that was what I was going to do. One way or another, that was what I was going to do.
So tell us about the Gray Pony. How you got involved with that?
Gray Pony. Gray Pony is a performance troupe and theater group. It was conceived of by an old friend of mine named Christopher Natali Pedito. He was, Chris was an old kind of, he was from New Jersey and Philly. I met him out here in the mid 80s. He'd moved out here not long before that, but he was always, he was a hero of mine, a mentor of mine. He was someone who was always a creator of community around poetry and the arts. Back in Philadelphia, he did that. He had a reading series back there. He ultimately had a press here in Los Angeles called Heat Press. He published Eric Priestley's poetry book and some other poets. But he went to graduate school kind of late, probably in his 40s or so, at Cal State Northridge, and he studied the oral tradition. And for his master's thesis project, he put together a performance where he scored poetry for multiple voices, and he involved me in that project. And actually, he involved me in an early version of that project. And then his thesis version of that project was all the poetry of Bob Kaufman. You know Bob Kaufman?
Yeah.
This book just came out recently. Actually, fantastic book of his selected poetry. You know, he was one of the few African American beat poets, and he was very much an oral poet based in San Francisco in North Beach. He often didn't write his poems down. He just memorized them, and they might change every time he declaimed them. So Chris's project was scoring the poetry of Bob Kaufman for multiple voices, and it was called The Poet Alive, and that was the birth of Gray Pony. And for Chris, it was kind of he was a scholar of the oral tradition, and he believed in, you know, taking poetry off the page and giving it back to the voice and the stage. And I thought that was such a cool thing that as soon as The Poet Alive was done, I said, I want to be part of this, and let's do more. So for years, in the late 80s into the early 90s, we did a series of these performances that we would do in coffee houses and galleries and things like that. And then it kind of evolved into full-scale theater productions, including one of our final ones was a production of Oscar Wilde's Salome. Now, most of the productions we didn't get big audiences, and many of the people who came didn't quite know what to make of what they were seeing. But we kind of lucked out. We did a version of Oscar Wilde's Salome that got Pick of the Week in the LA Weekly. So we had started out, it was a very surreal production. It was done in a small theater on Santa Monica's Theater Row called the Igloo. And we actually were a late night show after someone else's show. So we had somebody else's set, and their show was like a post-apocalypse, wasteland. So we had to come in with our props and set up quickly in the middle of their set. So our props were these big wooden objects that were painted, surreal and fantastic. And you had the main roles in Salome. You had Salome and King Herod and a few others. And then you had these choral roles, these secondary roles. And I was one of those. There was a soldier and, a servant or something. And the way we did those is we had these wooden figures with the heads cut out, and they had a handle behind them, and we would pass them around. So there were 4 people in the chorus. We'd pass these around, and each character in the chorus had a particular voice. So when you got the cutout for that character and that voice, you would take on that voice, and then you'd pass it to the next person, and they would take on that voice. So it was very surreal and fantastic and odd. And the first few nights, we had very sparse audiences, and they didn't know whether to laugh or to, how to take it. And then we lucked out. We got a critic from the LA Weekly named Bill Radin, who grokked what we were doing and loved it and gave us a fantastic review. And overnight, the audiences changed. We had full houses, and people were pre-programmed to like it. And they laughed, and we went from scheduled 8 performances to 4 weeks, 8 performances to an 8-week, 16 performance run. And we had a hit on our hands, and that was a hell of a lot of fun. So, that's kind of it. And we kind of tapered off after the early 90s, but every now and then we would kind of come out of retirement and do something. And Chris sadly passed away in 2014. But his wife, Barbara Romaine, who's a fantastic artist, and some of the other folks in Gray Pony, we have continued occasionally to do performances. The last one we did was for Cabaret Revoltaire in 2017, December 2017. It was the 100th anniversary of the birth of Dada. And, Cabaret Voltaire was the famous kind of salon performance of the original Dadaists. So there was a 100th anniversary, and they called it Cabaret Revoltaire, and we got to perform in that. So that was pretty cool.
Where
So
did the name Great Pony come from?
Well, it was Chris's idea of, Chris had a funny kind of marriage of influences, Chris Pedito. He was a scholar of the ancient Greeks, the ancient Greek poets, the birth of theater in ancient Greek poetry, and the orality of that, and how that was kind of the birth of theater, and poetry then was done, scored for multiple voices. And he was also a big fan of the beats. And he actually saw the beats as being kind of hearkening back to that oral tradition. So that was kind of old and young. So he, gray symbolized old and pony symbolized young. So that's where that name came from.
It was a prematurely old, but forever young.
Exactly.
Kind of
Exactly.
theme going there.
One story that might be kind of interesting about Gray Pony, and it actually ties into a poem. One of our alumni of Gray Pony, by the way, is Rich Ferguson. I'm sure you know Rich. People in the LA scene know Rich. He was a member through, I guess, the late 80s, early 90s. And there was one of the performances that we did, the first full-scale theater performance we did was called Festival Dionysus. And it was based on the idea that the birth of theater was in this festival to Dionysus, the god of wine, poetry, and song in ancient Greece. And the way this performance was conceived was kind of fantastic and wild and different, and chaotic by its nature. What we did is we got a whole bunch of people together, many of whom didn't really know each other that well, and Chris created what he called choruses. So different groups would go off and create their own material. And Gray Pony was always a mix of existing texts and stuff we wrote ourselves. So in Festival Dionysus, we had multiple choruses. There was the Bacchae, which was kind of like the Dionysus groupies. So that was mostly young women. And then there was the Median chorus, which was kind of the feminist chorus, also all women. And there was the Orphic chorus, which was kind of the wild, young, inspired poets chorus. And that was a mix of young men and women. And then there was the Ancients chorus, which I kind of thought was the Old Souls chorus, because I was in that, and I was actually in my 20s, but folks kind of considered me an old soul. So that was the Ancients chorus. That was the wise old men's chorus. And everybody went off and created their work as a chorus, and then came back for the show. And each chorus had about 20 minutes when you were on stage. And the idea was that there was a guy who was in the first Poet Alive, Bob Kaufman version of Gray Pony, named Tony Clay. And he was a fantastically talented poet, kind of mystic poet. He dabbled in the occult and, was very much about, ecstatic inspiration. So the idea originally for Festival Dionysus is we were going to have Dionysus be a character. And it was typecasting for Tony Clay to play Dionysus, because he's a very Dionysian poet. But Tony did a fair amount of drugs along with his occult stuff, and he was writing his own part. And this was in, I guess, about 1990. And Tony really seemed to become imbued with this idea that this group, Gray Pony, our friends, artists, were like on the cutting edge of a whole change of consciousness, a worldwide change of consciousness. And that this show we were doing, Festival Dionysus, could kind of be the harbinger of this worldwide change in consciousness if he just did his part as Dionysus right. Like, he almost felt like he could really channel Dionysus. And if he just wrote his part right and performed his part right, he could help trigger this whole change of consciousness. And we just, told him, look, don't worry about that. Just write a good part and play a good part. So came the night of dress rehearsal, our last practice run before opening night. And the way the show was supposed to start, he was going to run in the front door of the theater, run up and jump on the stage and, do his spiel. So he runs in for dress rehearsal, jumps on the stage, and he says to the whole cast, I realized I'm just not ready. I'm just not ready to be Dionysus. I'm not quite there. I can't, I'm really sorry. I feel like I'm letting you down, but I can't do it. And the cast was furious. Everybody was like really upset, and it was a crisis. Like, what we're gonna do? Opening night is a week from now. What the hell are we gonna do? We don't have our star. And he left, and then we all sat around. We realized, Dionysus is a god. This is a festival to Dionysus. You don't have to have Dionysus. So we decided to go ahead without him. So then opening night comes, and right as the show is about to start, the front door of the theater slams open, and Tony Clay comes running in and jumps up on the stage and proceeds, big surprise. We weren't expecting it. Some of us actually kind of half were expecting it, but he proceeded to give the most incoherent, rambling, drunken, drugged out version of his Dionysus monologue that he'd ever given.
How was it?
Huh?
How was it?
It was terrible. It was awful.
Okay. Well, some people like, performance of a lifetime. I mean, some people can, there's a sweet spot, right? There's a sweet range, right?
Exactly.
And for some people, they should just be sober, be whatever. But there's some people, they can hit a sweet range of improvisation and this and that.
Exactly, and that's what Tony
had. But nobody can perform over here. Like nobody can do anything over here, right? Yeah.
Exactly. That's what Tony had always been going for, and he had sometimes achieved it in the past. But this night, he had gone past that sweet spot, and then what he was supposed to do every night was go backstage after that, and then the first chorus would come out. So on his way backstage, to get backstage, there was a staircase you had to go down. And on his way down, Rich Ferguson, who was so fucking pissed off that he had done this, pushed him down the stairs.
Oh, shit.
And he came tumbling out the door into the backstage area where I was, and some of the choruses who hadn't gone on. And people started yelling at him like, Tony, God damn it, how could you, And he was like, I thought you'd be happy. I thought I came here to save the show. And and he stormed out very upset, and some of the people in the cast never spoke to him again. Some of us tried to reach out to him and kind of help him find his way back, to a more productive path. But, the thing is, he was a fantastically talented guy and a sweet guy and a lovely guy and a very promising poet and a promising performer. And it was kind of a sad story because, after that, he kind of, he moved to Paris for a while and tried to make it.
Where do you go after Rich Ferguson's throwing you down a flight of stairs?
Exactly. Well, right? So he went to Paris and he hung out a shingle as a tarot card reader and an occultist for a while. And then he moved to San Francisco and basically, now one of the things about Tony is that he truly believed, he was, I would say, mostly gay, perhaps somewhat bisexual. And he truly believed that his occult practices would magically, and his purity of heart and the purity of his poetry would somehow magically save him from AIDS and drug addiction. And sadly, he was wrong on both counts. He basically, in San Francisco, got beat up in a bad back alley drug deal and had acquired AIDS and, died in a public hospital. So it was a very sad outcome. You know, it was one of those things, you know, in the arts world, you know, these people, if you've been around long enough, who are these fantastically talented people who, for whatever reason, they self-destruct. And I wrote a poem for him after he died, which I wouldn't mind reading.
Yeah, please share it.
And I said a lot of this to him shortly after the Festival of Dionysus, but of course, it wasn't poetry when I said it. And when I wrote this, I was studying Zen at the time, so I was very into meditation. So I think of this as partly a poem about meditation that never says the word meditation. But this is called Elegy to the Mystic Poet Died Young, for Tony Clay. I would say to you, you can be wild and still. I would say to you, you can learn to make your magic free from that iron-bound trunkful of tools and toys. I would say to you, you can learn to take up the rhythm of the rolling bellows of breath in your chest for your rhythm, the music of the soft hiss of the blood in your veins for your music, rather than being danced and pulled by all that crazy howling around your ears. I would say to you, you can become enchanted instead by the altered state of suspension above the bottomless well. You can become entranced instead by the altered state of falling back into the arms of your watchful ghosts. You can become enthralled instead by the altered state of coming up slowly through the after image of your own dream. You must become addicted instead to the altered state of crouching in quiet at glade's edge and watching your own thoughts like wild animals in the field. And I would say to you, with the help of luck and trust, you may find that the true voice is the one that will not shout to be heard over all that frenzied emotion, is the one that will not chase you down through all that frantic running after seeking, is the one that can be heard as clearly as you may see the paths and lines in your own hand at rest on your own knee when you learn to be wild and still. That's Elegy to the Mystic Poet Died Young.
Let's have a smooth transition into your blog then.
Yeah,
days of blogging.
Yeah, I had a couple of different blogs back in, I guess, the late 90s, early 2000s. In a way, I had 3 different blogs. I had there was a writer that I know named Ernessa Carter, who had a blog called Fierce and Nerdy, fierceandnerdy.com. She's a novelist. She's been raising her daughter for a few years, so she hasn't written any novels in a few years, but she had a novel called 32 Candles. And I forget where her second novel was, but she was a good friend. And the way she did her blog is she recruited a bunch of writers that she knew and liked to have regular columns on her blog. And at the time, I had very long hair. For about 20 years, I had hair basically halfway down my back. So my first blog was called Hippie Squared. And then I had a second blog later called Left-Handed Jeff. And I also did a project on fierceandnerdy.com where and this is a project I've actually done twice in my life. In order to get myself to write poetry every day, back in late 1993, I conceived of this project where I kept a daily diary and 3-line poem. So every day I wrote a new 3-line poem. I did that from about September 93 to August 94. And just by luck, it happened to be the year that I met and courted the woman who eventually became my wife, Elise Rodriguez. But in, I guess, 2009, I decided to do the project again, but I decided to do it where I posted the poems online every day. So I posted a new 3-line poem online every day for a year. And the feature was called 3-Line Lunch because I posted it at noon. And it ended up being a very tumultuous year. So I didn't actually make every single day. But I also kept going after the year. So if you Google 3-Line Lunch, you will find a number of reminiscences by business executives from the 80s about doing cocaine at lunch. But you also find my poetry series. And since it was a daily diary, and ultimately I did at least 460 or so, some of them suck because I did them every day, you know, but some of them are really good, and I still stand by them. And some of them have become poems that I perform regularly, or they've expanded, and actually some of them ended up being a kind of suite of poems about the LA freeways that I called LA Freeway Songbooks, that was published in The Coiled Serpent, that fantastic anthology of LA poetry, which I'm so proud to be in. But yes, there's also an interesting little footnote. You know, if anybody ever does a Wikipedia entry on me, or if I ever get it organized enough to contribute to the Wikipedia entry on the word blogger, I actually invented the word blogger. But I invented the word blogger in about 1985 in a nonsense poem I wrote called Blogger Old Potatoes. It's kind of I mean, it's not really nonsense. It's kind of it's a story about a little girl, but she has her own curse word called blogger. You know, there's a stanza that goes, blogger old potatoes, she threw them on the wall, decorate the kitchen, decorate the hall, decorate the doggy, hear the doggy speak, decorate her mommy, hear her mommy shriek. So I made up the word blogger, but I made it up as the nonsense curse word of a 2-year-old girl in 1985. And it was published in a couple of places in a very small lit mag called LA 1956. And a friend of mine had an early literary website where he had a section of nonsense poetry that he called Bloggers, and he had my poem up there. But ultimately, of course, my word made it into the dictionary, but not my meaning of the word. And of course, it renders my poem forever. Like nobody could read that poem again in the same way, right? Because my definition has been overtaken by history. But oddly, an interesting thing, I actually wrote a blog about making up the word blogger. And when I did so, I Googled blogger old potatoes to find my poem that, you know, on my friend's website so I could link to it. And I found that the guy who had developed the original blogging software, which was called Blogger, on the day that his software was released, on his blog, he linked to my poem, because apparently he had probably Googled the word blogger himself and came upon my poem, and you know, was probably kind of surprised by that and seemed to have been kind of delighted by it. So he linked to my poem. So it was kind of odd circularity in that.
So have you ever talked to this guy? I mean,
no, I haven't. I probably should, right? You know, I wrote a blog on this. I should reach out to the guy.
Yeah, was he gracious in his acknowledgments, or was he like?
Yeah, he was. He was like, you know, he's kind of like, oh, this is, you know, he seemed kind of tickled by it. So yeah, I should reach out to the guy. Why not, right? What the hell?
Why not? Why not? There's a few in that. My definition has been overtaken by history. That's very poetic, Jeff. That's
Thank you. There's actually an odd family tradition in that as well, because the family tradition in my family, my mom's family, my mom's name, maiden name was Bishop, and my great grandfather, according to family lore, made up the name Oz because he worked in a small literary agency in Chicago with L. Frank Baum, who wrote The Wizard of Oz. And one day L. Frank Baum came to work, and he said, he was kind of musing out loud, and he was saying, I wonder what I should call this imaginary land that I made up. And my great grandfather pointed to the O through Z file and said, why don't you call it Oz? So, you know, my great grandfather invented this nonsense word that made it into the language, but he did not get credit for it historically. So there's an odd little family tradition there.
all right. So most recently, you, I, and an investigative journalist by the name of Greg Palast, Lee Beck, and a few others got together and did something over at Beyond Baroque. Can you tell us a little about it?
Sure. Yeah, that was a fantastic project. You had this thing going called Narratives of the Southwest, which I guess was originally conceived to be quarterly. And your first one was about Mexican American schools, and it was a great production. And it actually reminds me somewhat of Gray Pony in the way that, at least in the development of the one that we did, which was called LA Times Bomb, and it was about the, at least in part, about the bombing of the LA Times in, Jesus, I'm forgetting, 1911? Was it 1911? 1917?
1910, I think, actually.
Okay, yeah, 1910. Anyway, huge historical event in the history of Los Angeles that many people have kind of forgotten about, and really kind of changed the course of the history, because Los Angeles on the verge of electing a socialist mayor. And anyway, I won't tell the whole history, but this project that you conceived of was, and actually was partly based on, Lee Beck had done a version of it earlier that he involved you in, right?
Yeah.
But you did a version of it at Beyond Baroque, and it had a huge cast of people, many of whom were playing historical figures, and many of whom were just doing their own poetry, kind of echoing various themes of this event. And everybody kind of went off and developed their own material under your guidance. And none of us had ever performed it together until we actually did the performance on the day of. It was a pretty cool thing. And you actually originally approached me about playing Clarence Darrow, which I was very excited about because my middle name is Darrow, because Clarence Darrow was a big hero of my dad's. My dad is a political scientist and a kind of staunch atheist. So Clarence Darrow was a big hero of his. So I was like, oh, that's perfect for me to play Clarence Darrow. But then I found out that Greg Palast, the justly famous investigative journalist, had a hankering to play Clarence Darrow, who was also a hero of his. And when I finally met Greg,
in my defense, I did bump you, but Greg named his son Darrow.
Absolutely, yeah. We bonded over that. We bonded over that.
All right.
Yeah, no hard feelings. I completely understand. I mean, he's a celebrity journalist. Who am I? You know, I'm the guy who invented Blogger and didn't get credit for it. So, yeah, no, I totally. And he was a fantastic Darrow, and I'm actually kind of. I was very pleased in the end, because what you did is you had me play Lincoln Steffens, and I didn't know much about Lincoln Steffens, and he was a kind of fantastic, almost like a Zelig figure in history. He was a journalist who made his name originally writing a book called The Shame of the Cities, where he was an early investigative journalist. They called them muckrakers then, and he went around to a bunch of big cities and kind of investigated the corruption of each city and wrote about it, put this book out called The Shame of the Cities. But he also, I kind of made his name, but he kind of prided himself on being one of those people who could mix with the criminal element in any city, but also mix with the elites in the same city. And, you know, over time, he went to Russia right after the revolution and interviewed Lenin. And he went to Mexico during the revolution and traveled with some of the revolutionaries there. He was also friends with Theodore Roosevelt, and he basically claims that he personally talked Woodrow Wilson out of invading Mexico after the revolution and trying to put down the revolution, because he, you know, told Wilson that the revolutionaries were good guys and they weren't a threat to the U.S. But he also had this part to play in the LA Times bomb history, where he came, and so the bombing had been done by these labor activists, the McNamara brothers, and I forget how many people were killed in the bombing, but a bunch of people were killed in the bombing. And as best we can figure out, they didn't really mean to kill anybody. They had done a bunch of bombings in the past of construction sites, and they basically did it to force the bosses to enter into contracts with the union. And it worked most of the time, and nobody was ever hurt. But in the case of the LA Times, they planted the bomb outside of the building in an alley where they stored the big vats of ink that they used on the printing press, which were incredibly explosive and flammable. So it caused a huge explosion. Now, the other thing is that for weeks and weeks and weeks, employees of the Times had been complaining about gas leaks in the Times building. And General Otis, the owner of the Times, who was extremely anti-union and anti-socialist and you know, the worst kind of boss and employer, never did a fucking thing about the gas leaks. So there's a big explosion, and these guys, these labor activists, went on trial, and Clarence Darrow was persuaded to defend them. But after he had already committed to defend them, and he had never lost a client to the gallows before, even though there had been a couple of close scrapes. But the more he learned about what had really happened, the more convinced he became that his clients were going to hang. And Lincoln Steffens came to town, and Lincoln Steffens was a friend of Darrow's, or actually became a friend of Darrow's. And Lincoln Steffens conceived of this plan to negotiate this grand bargain between Otis and the other business, very, very, very anti-union, anti-socialist business leaders in LA, whereby the McNamara brothers would get a plea agreement, and the one who had actually planted the bomb would get life rather than hanging, and the other one would get a short sentence. And now the thing is, one of the other people on the team of the McNamara brothers, the legal team of the McNamara brothers, was Jobe Harriman, the socialist candidate for mayor. And he was in the polls leading handily and probably would have won the election. But one of the problems with this, the business leaders, part of their demand for this agreement was that it would be announced, the plea agreement would be announced before the election, like right before the election. And this would essentially have the effect of discrediting Jobe Harriman, because, you know, he had always protested the innocence of the McNamara brothers. So Lincoln Steffens, part of his negotiating this plea agreement was that the business leaders had pledged that they were going to have this kind of grand coming together with the labor leaders in town, and they would come to this grand bargain where the business people would give up their, you know, anti-union thing, and they would come to an agreement with the unions, and LA would be a union town, which, you know, Otis had basically said, over my dead body, that will never happen. But Lincoln Steffens got played, and they had this grand bargain, and the plea agreement was announced, and the judge nevertheless imposed a lengthy sentence on the other brother, and the business leaders never had their grand bargain with the labor leaders, and they basically played Lincoln Steffens. So I wrote a couple of monologues for that. Did a lot of research in Lincoln Steffens' autobiography and a book about Clarence Darrow, and I kind of played it almost like along the lines of a Greek tragedy, where Steffens' fatal flaw is his hubris, and he really believes that he has this gift where he can negotiate this grand bargain. But Lincoln Steffens always prided himself on being the cynical, sophisticated guy who could never be played, but he got played, and that was kind of his tragedy. But obviously, that's a version of the project that is very much through my lens.
No,
Jeff
very
Ryan.
much so. You actually pulled off what I asked of you. I mean, everyone else kind of doing what they want. Well, you know, the narrative Southwest, that LA Times bomb, that one specifically really was like a series of competing arcs. You know what I mean? Like, that's how I kind of envisioned it, like a series of competing arcs of like these just different like there's no real, because they're all monologues, so there's no real supporting characters, like no characters supporting other characters, that this character's going to learn a life lesson like that in a traditional way. So what it really was a series of arcs of people who experienced this thing around this thing.
Right.
So yeah, no, that I really appreciate you being a part of it. That was one of the more difficult things I've ever done.
Yeah, it was a fantastic project. I was so pleased to be part of it, and you know, Greg Palast was a great Darrow, and Lee Beck was a great Otis, and you know, you had people playing Francis Magone and you know, other incredible figures, and people just doing their own poetry that was, you know, very moving and powerful, and it was a great project, and I was very proud to be part of that, and yeah, very cool stuff. Very cool stuff.
So what's coming up? What projects are on the horizon? What are we looking at?
Well, I've been struggling with I feel like you know, my parents were active in the civil rights movement, so I was kind of raised on a certain consciousness of racial issues. One of my very first memories of seeing a movie out in the world was, I think I was 5 years old, maybe 6 years old. I remember sitting on a very hard metal folding chair in a high school gymnasium in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I grew up, watching a black and white documentary about the Montgomery bus boycott and the Birmingham marches, and seeing, you know, I vividly remember through my 5-year-old eyes. This was probably 1968, shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King, which was an important event that kind of got my parents activated in civil rights organizing. And my mom took me to this, and I remember seeing these very dignified Black people in their dark suits, and the women in their flowered dresses, and the children who were my age, and the vicious, snarling white cops, you know, with their vicious, snarling dogs straining at the end of their leashes and tearing the clothes and the flesh of these protesters, and blasting them with fire hoses like cannons, and beating them with batons. And that, you know, seeing that, I saw very clearly that the heroes in that scenario were the Black people, and the villains were the people who looked like me. And I never forgot that lesson. And, you know, I've always sought to be an ally or an accomplice, you know, from decades before those words were used to define those terms. And I can't, you know, make any claims as to how well I've done at that. It's not, you know, it's not, I'm a walking privilege burrito. I am wrapped in multiple layers of privilege. I am a heterosexual, cisgendered white male, raised middle class, well educated. So, you know, I have blind spots. I am not free of racism or sexism or any of that stuff. But I seek to be an anti-racist and a feminist and all of that. And, you know, one of the things that has become more and more obvious, it's very topical now with the Black Lives Matter protest, but I've been thinking about it for years. You know, it seems that in general, white writers have basically abdicated all responsibility for confronting issues of race. It's been considered by a lot of white writers to be a minefield, like you can only be blown up by those mines and you know, there's nothing to be gained from it. But it seems to me to be one of the many injustices of white privilege that we have the privilege of pretending that we can write in a colorblind way. And I think it's bullshit. And, you know, the responsibility for confronting issues of race and privilege and, you know, the violence that's been done by white people to Black people and to people of color for hundreds and hundreds of years has fallen on the shoulders of people of color. And, you know, it's one more burden. And so I've been struggling actually for some years to kind of figure out how to write about that stuff in a way that's not bullshit, because there are a lot of pitfalls in white people writing about racial issues. And you know, American Dirt is just one of the most recent and obvious examples of that. You know, white people trying to impersonate people of color and show off their empathy and just getting it wrong and fucking it up, and taking space from the people of color who want to tell their own stories. And actually one of the things that I wanted to write about is and I think that things like American Dirt, I think they come in part out of white unconsciousness of one of the main privileges that we've always had. And of course, that's the way privilege works, right? Is you're usually pretty much unconscious of it. And I realized some years back that one of the privileges that white people have always had is the privilege to define for the culture at large, as the gatekeepers, what racism is. Who are the racists? What thoughts and words and actions will be called racist? And I'm grateful to you and a number of my friends of color for essentially helping me to see that. You know, there are many things that can be said negatively about social media, but one of the things that I think is fantastic about social media is that I think it's given people of color a way past the white gatekeepers and the white bouncers in the cultural main square who've always kind of restricted how many people of color have a voice, right? As part of that privilege. And I've learned so much from your posts on Facebook and the posts of, you know, Chiwan Choi and Tika Lark and Peter Woods and Rocio Carlos and Doug Brown and Sarah Borjas and Jenny Yang, the comedian. And one of the things I've seen is these various instances of some white liberal saying or doing something that they don't think is racist. One classic example is Matt Damon in his show that he had on HBO, Project Greenlight, where I'm sure you know about it. I think I may have first seen it as posted about on your Facebook, you know, where there was some student film being made, right? And there was some problematic racial depiction in it. And there was a black, I guess, producer on the thing who said, you know, we really ought to have a director of color handle this material so it can be less problematic. And Matt Damon said something like, oh, the way we handle that is in the casting. Basically saying, no, we're not going to have a black director. We're going to cast a black person in the roles of the black person. And that's how we're going to handle this problematic issue. So, you know, Matt Damon probably did not think that he was saying anything at all racist when he said that. He thought he was being a good liberal, and but you know, he was being racist as fuck, and that was pointed out. I think the thing that happened that really truly made me see that this privilege of defining racism was a privilege that white people had always accorded ourselves was the Vanessa Place incident. You're probably familiar with this one, Matt? Vanessa Place? Okay. Vanessa Place was a white conceptual poet, is a white conceptual poet. And I'm not sure when this was. It was probably in the maybe 2016 or so, 2014. She was going to be hosting a panel or on a panel at AWP, the Writing and Publishing Conference that's held every year somewhere in the US. And it was going to be held in Los Angeles that year. And a group of writers of color basically got very pissed off that she was going to be on this panel and called her racist. And they specifically flagged this project that she was doing on Twitter, where, and this was supposed to be a conceptual poetry project, where she was tweeting out the entirety of the book Gone with the Wind, one tweet at a time. And back then it was 140 characters, right? And of course, the book Gone with the Wind is an extremely problematic book. It's racist as hell, and it's full of, stereotypes of the, loyal and stupid black slaves, enslaved people, and it's full of the use of the N word, and it's a horrendously racist text. One of the ways that I saw that at work personally is when I first met my stepmother in Arkansas. She was reading, this was back in the mid 90s. She was reading Gone with the Wind at the time, and she seemed to take it as authentic history. And the first evening we all sat down to dinner, she was talking about Gone with the Wind. She said, this is the lesson that she gleaned from Gone with the Wind. She said, those people were so nice to their slaves, and those slaves just turned on them. Which is appalling. It's just appalling, right? So Vanessa Place was tweeting out the entirety of Gone with the Wind, and she conceived of it as an anti-racist project because she was basically showing the racism of this revered book. And she was also a lawyer, and she had some notion of being not just a great white savior by doing this, but actually a martyr to the cause of anti-racism, because she was hoping to force the Margaret Mitchell estate to sue her for plagiarism, and then she would go into court and basically force them in court to defend the racism of this text. So that was her project. Now, me as a white liberal with an somewhat academic background, I'm a college dropout, but I had 4 parents who were all PhDs, so I could speak the lingo, and I, my brain was shaped by that to some extent. And I'm a lover of conceptual art, John Cage, and Yoko Ono, and John and Yoko's political conceptual stunts. So when I first heard about this project through the writings of the people of color who called it racist, and when I saw the project through my blind spots and my preconceptions at the time, I couldn't understand that formulation. I saw it and I immediately understood it as being an anti-racist project. And I was like, why are they upset? I don't get it. This is, clearly Vanessa Place is an ally. But I was I was smart enough not to say that out loud, post that on anybody's Facebook threads or anything, but rather to do my research, to closely read the objections of the people of color to this project, and to understand where they were coming from. And of course, at some point it clicked in, and I can't speak for anyone else. I'm paraphrasing as I came to understand it, but essentially Vanessa Place was basically a white liberal showing off her anti-racism to other white liberals. It was not a project for Black people. It was a project of ego and vanity. And, you know, look at me, I'm the great white savior, liberal martyr. But, you know, Black people didn't want to see that bullshit racist crap cluttering up their Twitter feed every day. Oh, I didn't mention, by the way, the profile picture was a mammy image. You know, Black people didn't need to be told that Gone with the Wind was racist, and they didn't need to see that racist shit in their Twitter feed every day. And there's a kind of aphorism of social justice that goes, whatever is about me without me is not for me. And that was part of my realization that, you know, that project was Vanessa Place showing off, and it was not for Black people. It was for white people. And I realized that, yes, in fact, it was racist as fuck. And that's when I realized that white people have always had this privilege of defining racism. And of course, we defined it in our own favor, in our own benefit. And as the, you know, the cultural bouncers, I call it, for decades, you know, the talk show hosts, the producers, the editors kind of allowed a certain small number of Black people to have access to the cultural main square at a time. You know, like, okay, we can have 3 people in there at a time. You know, we can have Martin, Malcolm, and James Baldwin. You know, Malcolm dies, maybe we'll let one more in. You know, Martin dies, we'll let Jesse Jackson in. You know, and that, of course, is bullshit. And so I've been trying to write an essay about that for some years, but again, you know, there's so many pitfalls, right? I don't want it to be virtue signaling. I don't want it to be me expiating my guilt. You know, I don't want it to be, I just don't want it to be bullshit, you know? So,
yeah, I mean, you telling me this, I mean, like, I'm not the type of person to like try and destroy people's careers for no reason, but there's all kinds of bullshit behavior and in the LA poetry scene.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's just fucking weird. I mean, but when you talk about the pitfalls, a lot of it's weird because there was a white poet in LA who was talking about, I feel as my position as a white man to open doors for poets of color, that blah, blah, blah. Dude, there will never be a time in your life when you open a door for Matt Sedillo. Like, seriously, dude, like, I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Like, honestly. Honestly, you can barely book the public library in the neighborhood you grew up in. Like, I know, I'm serious. Like, you're acting. People take on the mantle of like this anti-racist work, and they become completely delusional. Like, you are not my name versus your name. I mean, like, I'm serious. Like, you can't open doors for me. You know what I'm saying? I've been on C-SPAN. You can't open. It's impossible for you as an individual to open doors for me. Not possible. Like, the thing we're talking about is when all things are equal, and all of a sudden, like, wow, really? It went to him again. It went to him again. It went to him again. It went to him again, right? And that's when all things are equal. But like this idea that like somebody who some obscure white person is gonna come and like help somebody who's like notable and has all this notoriety, it's just not real. You're delusional, you know, and that's the kind of stuff that really irks me. That's the stuff that really irks the shit out of me, because I don't know what you're talking about. This idea that you're going to open a door for me, or that you're going to use your white privilege to somehow uplift me. Like, uplift? Are you fucking? You're going to uplift me? You're going to uplift me? Like, you're going to best political poet in America, poet laureate of struggle, finest of a generation, Greg Palast, Roxanne Ortiz. You're going to uplift me? What are you fucking talking about? You're going to amplify me? Thanks. I sold 2 books because you uplifted me. I sold 200 last week on my own. What are you talking about? So I mean, that kind of thing. That's the thing that really, I don't know, just because of the way I am. That's what irritates me.
Yeah.
But there are other things too. But I mean, I don't want to put anything on blast. I don't want to say that. But I do find there's a structural thing that like there are people that are always going to be gone to. Like, you know, like when LA Times comes around, when this comes around, when that comes around. And they're going to be the experts of Los Angeles, right? They're going to be the experts and the whatever. And I have thicker resumes than these people. Like, I've just done more than them. Like, I have done more than certain individuals who are constantly gone to. Like, my resume is longer, and I've been doing it for a short period of time.
Right.
And if I were to tell people that, they would think I was being arrogant or egotistical or whatever, and that's fine. Maybe I am those things, but like that's how I got ahead anyway. So by the way, but that's a fact. It's just like if you just bullet point the things people have done, like these like really really impressive things people have done. My resume is longer, and yet this person will constantly be the one that someone does. So that's all things being equal, and like, and it's not a question of like wanting like that person, other people not to get anything. It's a question of like this never comes to me. This
Yeah.
never happens. This is
Yeah.
never, and so like I don't want, these people are my friends. So I don't want to like whatever. But yeah, this is a thing. This is a thing, and it's very unconscious. And
It's a thing and it's very real.
and to complain about it or to say something about it puts me in a position where everyone's gonna like be like, oh my god, I can't believe how could Matt do that? What a terrible thing Matt's doing. Oh my god, blah 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 blah. Despite like how much more I've done for everyone there, but like but like whatever, man, whatever.
Well, that's why I feel like one of the responsibilities of white writers and white poets right now, if we do conceive of ourselves as allies or better still accomplices, is we need to be looking at whiteness. Black poets are out there writing about blackness. Latinx poets are out there writing about their experiences as Latinx people, and white people want to write about Latinx experiences rather than having the real honesty and the real vulnerability to look at their own whiteness and deal with their own whiteness. And for decades, they've avoided that. There's a whole book about that. Great book, White Flights by Jess Rowe, which Sarah Borjas turned me on to. Fantastic book about how for 50 years, white writers have, writers of literary fiction particularly have written as if they lived in a colorblind world, which is bullshit. So I think one of the responsibilities we have is to do some hard work looking at our whiteness and what that means. And
well, I'll tell you what, Jeff. I'll tell you what. Like after we go off live, I'll be specific with you, and you can go talk to your white friends because like this is getting ridiculous.
Yeah,
because it really is. It's
please do. I'm interested here. And another thing, I actually kind of want to issue two challenges. One to white writers and poets to take on the issue of whiteness, and but another one is, in my opinion, there are, in 2020 in Los Angeles, there are still too many poetry readings in Los Angeles that are either all white or mostly white. And white people represent 25% of the population of LA County. And, there are far too many readings where, it's all white or one person of color or whatever. And that's at a time when very obviously, most of the best work, most of the best poetry being written right now, the most urgent, the most inventive, the most challenging, the most passionate work is being written by poets of color. And it's just fucking obvious, all the folks that I named before, Rocio, Chuan, Sarah Borjas, Bridget Bianca, I could spend the next hour listing the names, so, and I think most of that is not consciously racist. A lot of it is kind of older white folks who, feature the people they know, and most of the people they know are older white folks. And, they don't mean any harm. And most of those poets they feature are good poets and not bad people. They're not consciously racist people, but there's a kind of racism of complacency and laziness there. And I think, I challenge any white host of reading series or anybody in town who's putting together readings. Don't be doing that shit anymore. It's don't be doing it anymore. It shouldn't be done. So.
All right. Well, I'm about building people up. I'm not about like destroying careers. So I'm not gonna put anybody on blast, but I will talk to you. I will.
Yeah, let's continue offline. We'll do the gossiping offline.
Yeah, because this is.
I'm with you. I'm not calling people out by name, but there are people who need to Look, I'm not, like I said, I'm wrapped in multiple layers of privilege and I have blind spots. I'm not free of any of that. And I value, I'm perfectly capable of saying stupid shit, racist shit, doing racist shit. And I hope that my friends, will call me out and that I will have the good sense to listen to them with humility and apologize where I need to apologize and learn whatever lessons I need to learn. That's what I seek to do. So I'm not some, saint or anything like that. So,
Yeah. All right, cool. Well, thank you so much for joining this hour, Jeff.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah. All right. Goodbye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.
All right. So I'm gonna take us off